In September 2025, Corvus Belli released an update to their tournament scenario pack that removed the game's historically most contentious scenario, Biotechvore. And while some of us might offer a moment of silence for Biotechvore's passing, it lives on as an example of the extremes of wargame scenario design and the impact that scenarios have on how a game is played. And so, in this video, we'll be using Biotechvore as a lens to think about how and why wargaming scenarios are designed, what makes a good one, and give you some tools to assess scenario packs for any wargame, and maybe help you pick, choose, design, or write scenarios yourself. So what will we and won't we be covering today? We'll be talking about why wargames have scenarios, how do you evaluate if a scenario is good, and then why was Biotechvore a great scenario and why was it a terrible scenario? We'll then conclude by thinking a little bit about how we can apply this to ITS Season 17 and to other wargaming scenarios. What we won't be doing is any kind of in-depth coverage of ITS Season 17 itself. At time of recording, it is very recently released, and I need more time to think and assess and come to conclusions about how it's going to change Infinity as a wargame. But while we won't be covering ITS Season 17 in detail, the ideas that we're covering here will be useful to you to think about whether or not you like the scenario pack. We'll also be following this video just in coming days with a final Biotechvore battle report, just as a showcase and reminder for why this scenario could be really, really good. So why do wargames have scenarios, and what makes a scenario good? There are three things I think that make scenarios need to exist and give us the tools to evaluate whether they are good. And we're going to break each of those down in turn. The first purpose of a wargame scenario is to encourage conflict. And this is one that I really want to emphasize because, especially if you're an experienced player, you might not be familiar with the idea that you actually really need to force people to play the game, especially if they are new. By default, most people as their baseline are conflict and risk averse, and to really engage with a war game, you have to seek out conflict and engage with risk. You have to have interesting and exciting things happen for the game to be fun, and for those interesting and exciting things to occur, there needs to be conflict. Think about any time you have ever watched two completely new players sit down and play any wargame without a scenario. The overwhelming amount of the time, both players will be very cautious about moving their units forward and exposing them to risk. If I move this unit forward, it might get shot, it might die. I might get charged by that big scary dragon. Something that I didn't expect might occur. It's better for me, all of my units will be safe if I sit back here and turtle and just be careful. And when you have two players playing that way, a game doesn't occur. And even for more intermediate players, unless we have some strong incentive to do so, we will usually be aware of the risks of moving forward and engaging our opponents, and so typically will do so in conservative ways. If I'm playing Conquest and there is no scenario and I have longbows and you don't, I'm going to shoot you from 22 inches away until you move forward. And if I'm playing Infinity and there's no scenario and I have hacking and guided missiles or spec fire, I might genuinely choose just to rely completely on those tools, even though they are resource inefficient, because they are zero risk in terms of their use. There's no chance of one of my units dying in ARO if I pursue those strategies. And so the fundamental purpose of any scenario is to make the players fight. It is to force engagement because that engagement is fundamentally necessary to a fun and interesting time, even if it's contrary to how most humans tend to operate. The second purpose of a wargaming scenario is to provide compelling and varied structures. And both of those things, compelling and varied, are important. Although this wasn't always the case, these days, most wargames are accompanied by usually a second publication that is a scenario pack. These are things like War Machine's Steamroller, which was almost the example of this, one of the very first ones. These are things like the ITS tournament pack, the Conquest tournament scenario pack, the Song of Ice and Fire scenario pack, etc. These are all separate publications that supplement the primary rules of the game and provide a pack of scenarios that all slightly influence how the game is played. And this serves a number of purposes. The first, just generally, is that structuring how the game is played and giving players objectives helps encourage conflict and give definition to a game, and gives players something mentally to engage with that is in addition just to the act of trying to annihilate your opponent. But by having these packs comprised of multiple different scenarios, companies are able to do a couple of things. The first is that they provide variety in how the game is played. If you were to imagine a situation where there are no scenarios in a war game and you are just playing, for lack of a better term, annihilation as a scenario every single game, then two games between two armies will always play out kind of the same way. By providing scenarios, you give each different game that uses a different scenario a different structure, and the same collection of miniatures that a player might have and might use in a game will perform and need to do things differently in different scenarios, which expands the value you get out of a limited wargaming collection. Without these varieties in structure, my single wargame army might only play a single way. But if I have a scenario pack with 10 or 12 or 20 scenarios, then at least theoretically, there are 10 or 12 or 20 different ways that my army might have to or be able to play to try and play and win a game. Kind of secondarily, and this isn't how we would assess whether a scenario is good, they do also serve a balancing effect. By being a supplementary pack that a company that produces a game can release, they allow the company a way to influence and inform how a game is played, to bring it in line with what they think the coolest way for their game to exist is, that doesn't require changes to the core rules. Now, this can be used as a balancing effect. We've seen especially things like the ITS pack include not just supplementary rules, but even scenarios that are better for some factions in the game to play. If you were a faction that had access to hacking, then a great deal of the previous edition of Infinity's tournament scenario packs were very good to you. But even though the effects of scenario packs on balance can actually be quite extreme, the underlying purpose is to give compelling and varied structures to the players to guide the way they play to fun and interesting and different experiences. And that keys into the third reason why scenario exists, and this is perhaps the oldest reason. Many of the first scenarios in any kind of wargame, the deep history of things like Warhammer Fantasy, etc., is that scenarios can use wargames to portray a narrative. And if you are a very competitive player, you might consider this to not be particularly important. And it's absolutely the case that different scenarios and different approaches to scenario designs can increase or decrease the emphasis of any of these three primary purposes. But I would genuinely say do not underestimate the importance to which narrative is actually a little bit important. Or to use a different word, one of the most important things that a wargame can do is be evocative. If a wargame that you are playing if you sit down and you have an experience that feels like the thing that the game is telling you that it's about, then you feel immersed and engaged, and the entire experience is more intense and usually therefore more fun. And while the focus of this channel generally tends to be on competition play and approaching game as a puzzle and thinking about strategy and tactics, it is still really important to me personally that the games I play feel evocative. And that's especially important when I'm learning a game or picking up a game for the first time. That the mechanics and story and experience engage me with the fantasy that it's trying to sell, because if it keeps me engaged, then I will play it long enough to learn it, and at that point I can sink my teeth into the tactics and strategy and complexity of the mechanics. I need that evocative introduction to the game first, and every scenario, to a greater or lesser extent, helps contribute to that narrative and therefore sense of evocativeness in a war game. And so, with these three purposes, and therefore metrics by which we might assess whether a scenario is good, firstly, to encourage conflict, secondly, to provide compelling and varied structure, and finally, to portray a narrative, let's take a look at Biotechvore and why it's great and why it's terrible. So, a quick recap of Biotechvore as a scenario for those who are unfamiliar, for people who might stumble across this video and who aren't Infinity players, or to Infinity players who might have joined the game recently and never really got around to playing the scenario because for some reason no one wanted to play it with you. Biotechvore at 300 points is played on a standard 48 by 48 inch table, but has a deployment zone that is much smaller than usual. It is 8 inches deep rather than 12 inches deep, which is to say it is 2/3 the size of a usual Infinity deployment zone. But in practice, the way tables in Infinity tend to be designed, that really does heavily constrain how much space you have to deploy and subsequently kind of unpack your army. And that shallowness of deployment zone feeds into the primary mechanic of Biotechvore, which is that you are in a position where you have this shallow, constrained, and vulnerable deployment zone that you must, with your entire army if possible, flee to escape to safe ground in the middle of the table. From your 8-inch deployment zone, there is a 16-inch death zone, a Biotechvore zone, where any units that are left behind in that zone at the end of your turn will suffer damage, usually resulting in their death either immediately or after a very short time in the zone. Now, the actual victory conditions for Biotechvore have varied over time, generally relying heavily on just having your models survive, but there have also been recent versions of the scenario that add random secondary objectives that also contribute significantly to the score. That's kind of secondary to the play experience that Biotechvore creates, which is that you have both players running out of their deployment zones with their entire armies to occupy a frankly very narrow portion of the middle of the table, with conflict and hilarity inevitably ensuing. And so, why is Biotechvore a great scenario? Well, because it succeeds on all three of our key measures for a scenario. It is very effective at all three of the things we talked about. It is extremely effective at forcing conflict to the point of ruthlessness. You must run with your army into the middle of the table, and so must your opponent. At that point, it is impossible not to have a fight. You are right there, they are right there, everyone has guns, and there is 100% going to be a dust-up no matter how risk-averse as a player you might be. Then, on our second metric, Biotechvore provides a highly unique game structure that is very much unlike other scenarios. There is no experience in Infinity most of the time that is quite like playing a Biotechvore game. Every other scenario in Infinity does force engagement. You have something that you have to do, that something is inevitably to bring you in conflict with your opponent, but only in Biotechvore do you have situations where both players are forced to have their entire force fight the entire enemy force at basically point blank range. And then finally, on our third metric, yes, Biotechvore is extremely narrative. Biotechvore absolutely feels like the story it's trying to tell. There is a plague encroaching in on both players, and they must flee to seek high ground, and there is a relatively limited amount of safe space, and the subsequent fight that occurs is a terrible and dangerous and desperate ships in the night moment. It is deeply evocative. And for all of these reasons, I genuinely love Biotechvore as a scenario because I have never had a bad game of Biotechvore. Games of Biotechvore are unique and violent and exciting and messy, and they are my kind of casual Infinity game. They are fantastic fun, but they are much better suited to casual Infinity, and that leads us into why is Biotechvore a terrible scenario? And it's terrible mostly because it over succeeds at all of our measures in a way that makes it hugely fun as a casual scenario, but really bad for competition and tournament play. And so if we think about, in broad terms, our metrics, but then how a scenario functions, competitively, we see the cracks begin to emerge. Biotechvore has flaws. The first of these is that it just doesn't really allow you multiple ways to approach the scenario. You must run your army into the midfield. If you can't, everything will die and you will lose. Now, this is a problem for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's not particularly varied. Games of Biotechvore can feel a little different from other games of Biotechvore, but compared to the variety of other ways other scenarios in the tournament pack can play out, every game of Biotechvore does feel kind of the same in that comparison. There is a very similar play pattern to every time you play Biotechvore, which means it only offers variety as an occasional scenario to play in contrast to the entire rest of the pack. It's also kind of an issue from a balance perspective. Because you cannot approach biotech for multiple different ways, you can only approach it one way. How well a faction does in Biotechvore is basically down to how well they can answer that core question. And not every faction can meet Biotechvore's main demand. Even those that can might have to build a list specifically for Biotechvore, and in a 3 or 5 round scenario event, that is putting other demands on you as a player, that can just eliminate entire factions from competition, which reduces the variety of the tournament overall. Now, specifically as a tournament concern, Biotechville also has problems in terms of the tables and setup. Because you must run into the midfield, and because you have a shallow deployment zone, a table not specifically designed to play Biotechville on, that is to say, one that allows lines of advance, that lets you get into the midfield, that lets you deploy safely in that smaller deployment zone, and then which caters to the midfield fight that's going to occur. If you don't have a table that does all of those things, it can just be a terrible experience. If you get locked in your deployment zone because there just isn't enough terrain on the table, you just die trying to escape, and the game ends and you had no control over that circumstance. If the middle of the table is open, then the knife fight that subsequently occurs is actually not particularly interesting, and again, everyone just kind of dies, and it's not very interesting. And you can even have experiences, and I have had these experiences to be fair, where a table might try to be made in a way that accommodates all of these, but where the table designer just didn't think about how maybe once the first player had gotten into the midfield, they could completely dominate the lines of advance from the second player's deployment zone, and that creates a hugely one-sided experience. All of these are issues where you have to build a table just for Biotechvore. And if you do, that's fantastic. The game is great, it's very enjoyable, it's novel, even if it isn't novel relative to other Biotechvore games. But at an event, that's just not something that you necessarily have the luxury of doing. In Infinity, scenarios have to be reasonably accommodating of a variety of different table layouts and structures and densities, because in a tournament, I 100% guarantee you that there will be a huge variety of different table layouts and structures and densities. Some tables will be good, quote unquote, some tables will be bad, some tables will prevent different challenges. And Biotech 4 is just not a scenario that accommodates tables that present any other challenges. The scenario presents more than enough challenges of its own, and adding in any complications caused by the table can just be overwhelming. And then finally, as we've kind of already noted, Biotechvores, even good games of Biotechvore, do tend to play out the same way. Once you've played it a few times, you kind of know how it goes. And so this leads us to the conclusion that Biotechvore is ultimately over-engineered. The best scenarios keep all of the goals of scenario design in mind, but they don't straitjacket you. A good scenario encourages conflict without demanding it. It provides structure without enforcing it, and it suggests narrative without overwhelming with it. And Biotechvore, as much as I love it, overshoots all of those marks. And that makes it wonderful for one-off, casual, occasional games, like the ones that will feature in the battle report that will follow this video in a day or two, but makes it genuinely terrible for tournament play in Infinity the game. Biotechvore is hilarious and wonderful to play as a one-off, but it is terrible to play multiple times in preparation for an event, and then at an event in question if you hit one of those tables that's just not designed for the scenario. And so for all of those reasons, as much as I love Biotechvore personally, removing it from the official scenario pack for Infinity tournament system and consigning it to the archives and annals of history, you can always go back to any of the old ITS packs which are publicly available and find it and play it if you want to, is probably the best way forward. And so just to tie a bow on all of this, how is everything that we've just talked about useful? Well, when you are thinking about, or if you are writing a scenario yourself for any wargame, or Affinity or otherwise, think about those three key metrics. Does your scenario encourage conflict? Does it provide an interesting structure? And does it, to a greater or lesser extent, tell a story? Once you're comfortable that you do all of those three things well, think about whether or not your scenario is a light touch or a heavy touch. Does it straitjacket players a little bit like Biotechvore, or are there potentially multiple ways to play the scenario? Will it play out the same way most of the time, or different ways most of the time? And a pretty good rule of thumb is if your scenario encourages conflict but doesn't demand it, provides an interesting structure but doesn't enforce it, and tells a story but doesn't overwhelm with it, you've probably hit the sweet spot for a great scenario generally and a good scenario in particular for competition or tournament play. Now, just a quick note in terms of ITS Season 17. That's the change that was the genesis for this video, and if you're like me, you'll probably want to take a little bit of time to think about it. It represents a big change to Infinity. Scenarios, as we've discussed, fundamentally inform how the game is played. Just to mention it briefly, I am kind of optimistic about Season 17, but I need to ruminate on it a little bit first. And so, I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective on Infinity's most contentious scenario, and I also hope you'll enjoy the silly little battle report that will accompany it soon. We will, of course, be back next week with more Infinity content. I'll be looking to get games in and do reports on as many of the new scenarios as I can, and I'll also be looking at providing an assessment on ITS 717 and talking about the scenarios. For those of you in the comments, if you've had any interesting experiences with Biotechvore, pull one out with me and let me know how you felt about the scenario. If you're looking forward to ITS Season 17, give me some thoughts about it. Let me know how you're feeling it. Let me know what kind of analysis you're looking for. Otherwise, for everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this dive into what makes a good wargame scenario, and I'll see you next week with more content.